Hi, guys. Thanks for jumping on for the daily roundup. Obviously, we've somewhat been dominated by Ukraine, but in East Asia Pacific today, we had 24 issues and we assessed one issue in Indonesia. Uday and I will cover off that in a minute. I'm sure we'll touch on Ukraine, but I want to make it very clear for listeners and to our members that if you've got interest in Ukraine, the way it's being presented in the Western media and by a whole string of supposed experts, all lined up between one expert who doesn't seem to be getting it right. Got to be really careful that you're not following a media that's leaning without any objectivity, with bias, and with a very superficial copycat type mentality. And I'll leave that for Bhargav and others to maybe touch on later. As well as our Myanmar daily report, which continues to be a country in a real state of crisis nationwide, not in little parts of it. But in Indonesia, the labour issues are quite pressing. There were labour protests in Indonesia today. They're also muted for tomorrow as well. The Indonesian Trade Union Alliance Congress, known as CASB, has basically stated that it's protesting outside the Ministry of Manpower. There are also other strikes being muted relating to this in March, and other groups are also talking about joining them for protests in March, but also for shows of power this week. And some of that's some fairly petty stuff, it would seem, to the outside world, but people living on the poverty line, and they've been told that if they get cut off from a workplace of employment, they used to be able to, after a month, access fundamentally their superannuation to see them through. They've now been told they can't access to that until they're 56. So, Uday, you might like to comment on that. Obviously, they don't seem to be major protests, but there's an underlying series of issues of frustrations, and actually I'm surprised we haven't had larger demonstrations pertaining to various bills that have been passed over the last 12 or 18 months.
Yes, definitely, Paul. That's a good way to put it. I think since President Jokowi has come to power, especially since his last term, he's been trying to liberalize Indonesia's business environment, but it is quite the mammoth task, I think. These protests are just showing some of the challenges to implementing laws and the government's issues that come with Indonesia, which we have discussed a lot about, Paul.
Yeah, and look, I mean, the combination of a lot of the government at the higher end, at least, public services, I can only say insidious corruption, insidious inefficiencies. There are some very good laws in Indonesia, but some very bad ones. And the bad ones tend to not do any favours for companies that are wanting to lay off staff that aren't performing. So this is a real battle. How do you keep yourself, when you've got 250, 260 million people, how do you keep yourself competitive when you've got archaic laws that are designed to pass everything in what is a absurdly paternal society? Whereas if you employ someone, there's no real productivity demands on them, and there's a whole heap of responsibilities on the employer. And if you look at countries like Thailand that on the surface are higher cost in terms of labour, but their efficiencies are just so much higher, the way they treat foreigners and investors is so much more liberal. Vietnam, where it's communist and it's certainly not a clean sheet on the corruption side, but it's much easier to do business because you're dealing with one entity. The lack of predictability in Indonesia is going to see more instability. I don't think in the short term, perhaps maybe not even in the election, but at some point, the never-ending pressure cooker of Indonesia is going to blow again. Uday, anything to add to those comments before we move on to South Asia?
Right, so moving over to South Asia, where we covered 2 events as major developments and 11 other developments. So firstly, I want to bring up the violence during protests in Shivamogga in Karnataka. So just over the weekend, an activist from the Bajrang Dal, which is a Hindu right-wing nationalist organization, was killed. Now, we don't know whether this was a communal killing or what the motive was, but this has set off protests between the Hindu and Muslim community, and there was violence in Karnataka yesterday. And this issue seems to be spreading, and the tensions are not going anywhere. And the backdrop of this is the elections, of course, in major states such as Uttar Pradesh that are ongoing at the moment. Bhargav, do you have anything to add here? Otherwise, I'd like to talk a little bit about Pakistan.
Yes, Uday, just a couple of points. What businesses need to be aware of is that the communal issue is a critical one, especially in the coastal districts of Karnataka. Now, the coastal districts are agrarian in nature, except a couple of ports, which are quite important for the state's economy. And the state's economy is nearly $250 billion. Of course, most of it is focused towards a couple of cities like Bangalore. However, the ports are still important. Now, the question of communal violence spreading to critical junctures, critical areas across the state is questionable because most of the violence and the tensions are focused towards a district called Shimoga where the actual killing happened. And the police in general are fairly competent in tackling mass protests, mass violence as such, especially in the coastal district. They have a reputation of using heavy hand, using certain legal tools such as Section 144, which prohibits assembly of people beyond three or four members. So to that extent, businesses need to be aware of which district they are dealing with, because district is a primary unit of administration for law and order as well as economy. So businesses in Bangalore, Mysore belt need not worry too much. However, they need to keep an eye on how the communal violence and tensions spread. Uday, that's it from south of India.
Thanks, Bhargav. So, in moving over to Pakistan, so yesterday, authorities released 46 prisoners of the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan because they're trying to reach a permanent ceasefire and peace agreement with the group. Now, this is very interesting because peace talks in November last year, there was a ceasefire for 1 month, and peace talks failed between the two. Now, it's a very absurd situation when a state with a modernized military is negotiating with terrorists. Well, they regard them as terrorists, and yeah, Bhargav, the complexities of this issue are quite deep. Do you want to get us?
It is indeed interesting, Uday. I must note two vantage points here. The first vantage point is that a non-state militia called Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, with alleged links with notorious Afghan Taliban, is holding the state, that is a garrison military-backed government of Pakistan, hostage by demanding release of bona fide criminals who have committed mass atrocities be released. Now, it depends on how you look at this development. Now, the second vantage point is that the military as well as the civilian government are being prudent because there is a lot at stake. The economy is in doldrums. They cannot really risk further exacerbation of security issues because the Chinese are not going to tolerate that beyond a point. And without Chinese backing and infrastructure projects, the economy is going to go down further. So keeping all of these components in view, we need to note that military is going to take a critical view of the situation, and if further leverage is given to TTP, they're not going to stop at that, and it's unlikely that they're going to mainstream into a political party. Although there are several Islamist political parties, but TTP is likely to bite into a bigger pie rather than be part of the pie. So Uday, I guess that's where I will underline Pakistan's situation.
No, I think you've covered it well. And just as a reminder, the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan has been responsible for some of the biggest attacks in Pakistan over the past 15 years. And they are a very violent criminal organization. And, this doesn't bode well for the security situation in Pakistan. Because as Bhargav, you said, they're not going to stop with just a ceasefire until they get their demands. So I guess we can move on to the Middle East now, where Bassel will tell us of what's happening over there.
Thank you, Uday. So in the EMEA region today, we had 2 assessed events and more than 24 other developments. One of the major events that happened in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, another Houthi drone attack on southwestern Saudi Arabia. The drone attack targeted the Jizan regional airport in Jizan province. At least 16 civilians from shrapnel during the interception of the drone were injured. The drone was launched from the Sana'a International Airport in Yemen. We expect actually disruptions to air travel are possible if the Houthi rebels intensify their aerial offensive on Saudi Arabia, like what happened with the Abha International Airport around 10 days to 12 days ago. In Europe, in the UK, strikes continue. Around 3,000 Airbus employees threatened to go on strike over pay disputes. So the employees are members of the Unite Union. They have voted to take actions against the low pay offered by the Airbus company. Actually, 94% of the members voted in favor of a strike action. The strike action will likely target the Filton site, which designs, tests, and manufactures wings for commercial aircraft. It is also expected that the strike will start in March. Over to you, Sitati.
Sitati, before you bring in the African issues, I would like to cover off quickly on Ukraine and state that we have released an update to our assessment of Ukraine and Russia situation. And we have covered off on how things are different from what the Western media is alleging that Russia has invaded Ukraine. We must note that Russia has legitimized their move into the restive and separatist regions of Luhansk and Donetsk. And this is very much part of the Russian playbook. So you can refer to our discussion on the Russian tensions, which was released earlier today. Over to you, Sitati.
Well, thank you, Bhargav and Bassel. In the case of Africa today, we covered 11 developments. And a foiled cash in transit heist in Johannesburg, South Africa, was assessed. In essence, at least 10 suspected robbers were yesterday killed by police officers in a cash in transit heist along the Hekla Road in Rustenville suburb in Johannesburg City. And to add to this is that 5 police officers are also injured by the suspected robbers. And then while the cash in transit heists are common in South Africa, especially in Johannesburg City, attackers are lately deploying highly sophisticated rifles and tactics. And another important developmental trend is that more army and police officers are increasingly being involved in staging some of the latest cash in transit robberies. For instance, an army officer and a police officer were among some 13 cash in transit robbery suspects who were arrested in Carletonville suburb in the Western District on February 11th this year. And as a result of these latest developments, clients in South Africa, especially those ones with operations in Johannesburg City, are advised to pay close attention to security protocols and vehicles used for the cash in transit operations. And to add to this is that for more bespoke advice on the latest lethal cash in transit heists in South Africa, please contact us or contact APAC Assistance for further information on these developments. So unless there's any other comment or question concerning this particular incident, I'd like to hand it over to Bhargav to close today's recording session. Thank you.
Okay, so I think with that, we'll call it a day. Please do reach out if you want to know more about our bespoke membership services. We do audio briefings as well as detailed assessment reports. If you need more details on tense areas such as Russia and Ukraine or Kazakhstan for that matter. Thank you very much.